In 1890, the United States recorded 63 million people. Names, families, histories, the most detailed census ever created. And then it vanished. Not partially, not accidentally. Almost all of it. Gone, burned, neglected, destroyed. But here's what makes it worse. Some of it survived, and they still chose to erase it. Try this, right now. Don't just listen, do it. Open a genealogy website, type in your last name. Start with someone you know, your grandmother, your great-grandfather. Follow the line backward, one generation at a time. At first, it feels almost addictive. Names appear. Dates line up. Places start forming a map in your head. You see patterns, migration, marriages, births stacked across decades. It's like assembling a puzzle that was always yours. You just never saw it before. You begin to feel connected, not in an abstract way, in a real, almost physical sense. These people were real. They lived, they struggled, and somehow their choices led to you sitting here right now. So you keep going. Further back, deeper, another name, another record, another life. And then it stops. No warning, no gradual fade. Just nothing. You click again, refresh, try a different database. Same result. A hard stop. Like history itself just shuts off. Most people brush it off. Old records get lost. Maybe that county had a fire. Maybe the documents just didn't survive. That explanation feels reasonable at first. Until you realize something unsettling. It's not random. Because when you start talking to other people, friends, strangers, researchers, you hear the same story. Over and over again. Different families, different states, different backgrounds, but the same exact ending. They all hit the same wall, the same year, not close to 1,890, not around that time, exactly 1,890. Like someone drew a line through history and said, nothing before this matters. Think about that. Millions of people, entire generations, gone from the record, not scattered, not partially preserved, just erased. Genealogists have a name for it. They call it the 1890 brick wall. And once you know that term, everything changes. You start noticing how common it is. Forums filled with frustration. People who've spent years researching their ancestry only to be stopped cold at the exact same point. It doesn't matter if your family came from New York, Texas, or somewhere in between. Sooner or later, you hit 1,890, and the trail dies. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this isn't happening in some forgotten corner of the world. This is the United States. By the late 1800s, America wasn't disorganized. It wasn't careless. It was expanding, industrializing, documenting everything. Land, property, immigration, population. The government was obsessed with records. Counting people wasn't optional. It was power. So how do you explain this? How do you explain a gap so precise, so consistent, so absolute, that it affects nearly everyone trying to look back? At first, you might think, maybe records before that just weren't detailed. Maybe people are exaggerating. Maybe it's just coincidence. But then you learn something that changes everything. 1,890 wasn't supposed to be a weak point in history. It wasn't a year of poor documentation. It wasn't a gap. It was the opposite. 1,890 was supposed to be the most detailed record America had ever created. A full snapshot of the entire country, every household, every name, every life. And yet, that's the exact year that vanished. So now the question isn't just what happened. It's much worse than that. How do you lose the most important record ever created and leave behind a silence that millions of people still run into today? If 1,890 was just another missing year, this wouldn't be a mystery. It would be a footnote, a small inconvenience for historians. Easily explained, easily ignored. But 1,890 wasn't ordinary. It was supposed to be revolutionary. The United States had been conducting censuses since 1790, every 10 years, counting people, tracking growth, trying to understand itself. But by the time 1890 arrived, something had changed. The country had exploded in size. Cities were growing faster than anyone could track. Immigrants were arriving by the millions. Industry was rising. The old methods, pen, paper, manual counting, were no longer enough. The 1,880 census had taken 8 years to fully process. 8 years just to count people. By the time the results were finished, they were already outdated. So for 1,890, they did something radical. They brought in a young inventor named Herman Hollerith. His idea was simple and terrifyingly powerful. Instead of counting by hand, he created a system using punched cards. Each person became data. Each answer became a hole in a card. Machines would read those holes, sort them, count them, organize them. For the first time in history, humans were being processed like information. Nearly 63 million Americans were recorded this way. Each one turned into a card, fed through machines, sorted into categories. It was faster than anything the world had ever seen. The results? What took 8 years before, now took 6 months. 6 months to count an entire nation. It wasn't just efficient, it was a breakthrough, a moment that would quietly shape the future. Because Hollerith's company, the one behind those machines, would eventually become something much bigger. A name you've heard before, IBM. Think about that. The same census that disappeared also gave birth to one of the most powerful technology companies in history. But the technology wasn't the only thing that made 1,890 different. It was the questions. This wasn't just about counting heads. This was about understanding people in a way that had never been done before. The government wanted details, precise ones. Where were you born? Where were your parents born? How long had you been in the United States? Were you a citizen? Could you speak English? They went deeper. If you were a woman, how many children had you given birth to? How many were still alive? If you owned property, did you own it outright, or were you in debt? If you were a veteran, which side did you fight for? Union or Confederate? How long did you serve? Were you injured? Where could your former comrades find you? This wasn't just data, this was identity. A complete snapshot of a nation at a turning point. Because 1,890 wasn't just another year, it was the moment America changed, from rural to urban, from scattered to structured, from expansion to consolidation. This census captured all of it, in detail. No other census ever would again. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Because we're not talking about missing scraps of history. We're talking about the most complete record ever created. The one document that could tell millions of Americans exactly where they came from. And it didn't fade away over time. It didn't slowly decay. It was there, complete, organized, processed. And then it vanished. Not just lost, not just damaged, removed from history. So now the mystery deepens. Because the question is no longer, what was 1,890? The question becomes, if this record was so important, why wasn't it protected? If the 1,890 census had only counted people, it might not have mattered. Names, age, addresses. Useful but replaceable. But that's not what 1,890 did. It went further, much further. For the first time, the United States wasn't just counting bodies, it was dissecting identity. Every question on that census dug deeper than before. Not just who you were, but what you were. Race wasn't recorded simply as black or white. It was broken down into categories most Americans today have never even heard of. Precise, fragmented, clinical. As if the government wasn't just observing people, but classifying them. Then came immigration. Where were you born? Where were your parents born? How many years had you been in the United States? Were you naturalized, or still an outsider on paper? Language. Could you speak English? If not, what did that mean for your place in society? Then the questions turned inward. Into the home, into the private lives people rarely spoke about. For women, how many children have you had? How many are still alive? Think about that. Not just counting births, but measuring loss, quietly recording grief inside a government document. For property owners, did you own your home, or were you drowning in debt? Did your farm carry a mortgage? This wasn't just economics. It was a map of power. Who had stability, who didn't. And then came the war. The Civil War had ended 25 years earlier. But its shadow was still everywhere, and the 1,890 census captured it in full detail. If you were a veteran, everything was recorded. Your name, your rank, your regiment, the exact dates you served, down to the month, your injuries, your disabilities, where you could be contacted, so others could find you. So, claims could be made, so the past could stay connected. This wasn't just data collection, this was memory preservation. It was the last complete attempt to document the people who lived through the war that nearly tore the country apart. The last chance to capture their stories before they disappeared forever. And then there was something even bigger. Something most people never think about. The 1890 census didn't just record individuals. It recorded a moment, a line in history. For decades, America had something called the frontier, a moving edge of civilization, a place where the map wasn't finished, where land was still being claimed, where identity was still forming. But in 1890, that changed. The government made it official. There was no longer a clear frontier line. The country had filled in, connected, closed. Think about what that means. For the first time, America was no longer expanding outward. It was turning inward. Everything that defined the country, its restlessness, its movement, its chaos, had reached a boundary. And the 1890 census captured that exact moment. The end of one era, the beginning of another. So now step back. Look at everything this single document contained. Millions of names, family structures, immigration histories, economic realities, war records, social classifications, and the exact moment a nation transformed. It wasn't just a census, it was a blueprint, a complete map of who America was, and how it became that way. And now imagine losing that. Not pieces of it, not fragments, almost all of it. Which leads to a question that's harder to ignore with every detail you learn. Was this just a tragic loss? Or was it the disappearance of something too revealing to keep? Asterisk, asterisk. By now, you might be thinking, okay, it was detailed, it was important, but records get lost all the time. And you'd be right. History is full of gaps. Documents burn. Archives collapse. Time erases things. But here's what makes 1890 different. It wasn't just a record. It was a timestamp. A snapshot taken at the exact moment America transformed. Everything was changing. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. For decades, the country had been expanding west, pushing outward, claiming land, building settlements, chasing something undefined. Freedom, opportunity, identity. That movement had a name, the frontier. It wasn't just geography. It was an idea. The belief that there was always more land, more chances, more beginnings, waiting just beyond the horizon. But in 1890, that idea died. The Census Bureau made a simple statement, almost casual, almost easy to overlook. There was no longer a clear frontier line. The unsettled land had been broken apart, filled in, connected, which meant something profound. There was nowhere left to go. For the first time in American history, the country had limits, and that changed everything. A few years later, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner would argue that the frontier had shaped the entire American identity. Individualism, risk-taking, movement, the idea that you could always start over somewhere else. And now, that was gone. But that wasn't the only shift happening in 1890. The country was no longer rural. It was becoming urban. Cities were exploding. For the first time, multiple American cities crossed the 1 to million population mark. Crowded streets, factories, tenements, noise, density. At the same time, ships were arriving daily, carrying people from all over the world. Languages mixing, cultures colliding. In 1892, Ellis Island would officially open, becoming the front door to a new kind of America. And while millions were arriving, others were being pushed out. That same period saw one of the darkest events in American history, the massacre at Wounded Knee, a moment that effectively ended centuries of native resistance. Think about the contrast. On one side, immigration, growth, expansion. On the other, erasure, displacement, endings. Two forces moving in opposite directions. At the exact same time, and right in the middle of it, was the 1890 census, recording everything, every shift, every person caught inside that transformation. It captured the last moment of one America, and the first moment of another, which makes what happened next even harder to accept. Because losing random records is one thing. Losing this is something else entirely. This wasn't just a list of names. It was the only complete snapshot of a nation at its turning point. The last clear image before everything changed. And then, that image was destroyed. Not before it was created. Not before it was processed. After. Which raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore. Why is it always the most important moments that disappear first? If the story ended with a missing record, it would still be disturbing, but it would be simple. What makes this different is that we know exactly when the destruction began. March 1896. Washington, D.C. A government storage building known as Marini's Hall. Late at night, a watchman noticed something wrong. Smoke. Thin at first, then thicker, creeping through the building. By the time anyone reacted, it was already too late. Flames spread through sections where census materials were stored. Paper, dry, stacked, perfect fuel. Fire doesn't negotiate. It doesn't preserve what matters. It takes what it reaches. By morning, entire portions of the 1,890 census were gone, destroyed beyond recovery. But here's where things take a strange turn. The materials that burned weren't the main population records. They were the special schedules. Records of mortality, crime, poverty, institutionalized individuals, the deaf, the blind, people on the margins of society, the most vulnerable, the most invisible, all of that, gone in one night. Officials assessed the damage and made a decision. The burned and damaged materials would be disposed of. No attempt to reconstruct. No large-scale recovery, just removal. But the core of the census, the actual population schedules, the records of nearly 63 million Americans, were reported as safe, intact. In fact, years later, in 1903, a census clerk examined those records. His conclusion? They were still in fairly good condition. So, let's be clear, the 1,890 census wasn't destroyed in 1896. Not completely. Not even close. It survived. For years. Stored. Waiting. Still holding millions of names. Millions of identities. Millions of connections to the past. Which should have been good news. Because disasters happen. Fires happen. But if the core survives, history survives. Except, that's not what happened here. Because instead of being protected, instead of being moved somewhere secure, instead of being treated like the irreplaceable national record it was, the census stayed where it was, vulnerable, unprotected, and slowly forgotten. Think about that. The most detailed record ever created. A complete snapshot of an entire nation. Survived a fire, only to be left sitting in storage. No urgency, no priority, no sense that this was something that needed to be preserved at all costs. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Because accidents explain destruction, but they don't explain neglect. They don't explain why something so valuable was treated like it didn't matter, and they definitely don't explain what happened next. Because the first fire didn't erase the 1,890 census. It only weakened it, left it exposed, waiting for something worse, and that something came 25 years later. For 25 years, the 1,890 census survived. Not perfectly, not untouched, but alive, stored somewhere in Washington. Boxes, shelves, paper stacked in silence, holding the names of nearly 63 million people, waiting to be preserved, waiting to be protected. And that's the part that doesn't make sense. Because by the early 1900s, the government understood something clearly. Some records are irreplaceable, so they built for that. Inside the Commerce Department building, there was a vault. Not just any vault. A fireproof vault. Concrete ceiling. Reinforced structure. Designed for one purpose. To protect documents that could never be recreated. The kind of place you'd expect the 1,890 census to be stored. But it wasn't. Instead, those records were placed somewhere else. In the basement. Not inside the vault. Not behind reinforced protection. But outside it. Stacked on wooden shelving. Right next to a carpenter's workshop. Filled with sawdust. Wood shavings. Dry, flammable debris. And even worse, near the furnace room. Heat. Fuel. Paper. All in one place. It was a setup that didn't just allow a fire. It invited one. January 10th, 1921. A Monday. Late afternoon. Most employees had already left. A watchman named James Foster noticed something. Smoke, seeping through openings in the pipes that connected the basement to the rest of the building. He reported it immediately. But what happened next would change everything. By the time firefighters arrived, the situation was already out of control. The basement was filling with smoke. Access was limited. Visibility was near zero. So they did what they had to do. They cut holes through the floors above and poured water down into the basement. Not one stream, not two, more than a dozen. Water flooded the space. Relentless, uncontrolled. The fire was eventually contained that night. But the damage didn't stop when the flames died. Because what the fire didn't destroy, the water did. The next morning revealed the truth. The basement was covered in water, ankle deep in places. Records soaked, blackened, warped. And then came the detail that changes everything. That fireproof vault, its door had a broken glass panel. Water had seeped inside, damaging records that had actually been protected. But the 1,890 census, it had never been inside the vault at all. It had been sitting outside, exposed, directly in the path of the fire, directly in the path of the water, exactly where it could be destroyed. Later, officials assessed the damage. 25% of the records, completely gone, burned. Another 50%, damaged by water, smoke, and heat. But here's the part that doesn't fit the story people usually tell. That still left 38% of the census intact, untouched, undamaged, still usable. More than a third. Enough to preserve millions of names, millions of connections, millions of histories. And officials knew it. They estimated it would take a few years, and about $2 million, to copy and save what remained. It wasn't impossible. It wasn't even unrealistic. It was a choice. And what happened next proves it. Because instead of rushing to preserve those records, instead of treating them like the national treasure they were, they hesitated, delayed, and then they did something far worse than losing them in a fire. They allowed them to disappear, not by accident, but over time. After the fire in 1921, the official story should have ended with loss. A tragedy, an accident, something unfortunate but understandable. But that's not what happened. Because when the damage was finally assessed, something unexpected emerged. Not everything was gone. Far from it. About 25% of the 1,890 census had been completely destroyed by fire. Another 50% was damaged, soaked, burned, fragile. But that still left something critical. 38% of the records survived. Let that sink in. More than a third. Millions of names. Millions of lives. Still intact. Still readable. Still recoverable. This wasn't a total loss. This was a damaged archive, with a significant portion still alive. And the officials knew it. They ran the numbers, estimated the cost, estimated the time. 2 to 3 years. Around $2 million. That's what it would take to copy and preserve what remained. Not easy, but absolutely possible. Especially for something this important. Because what we're talking about here isn't just paperwork. It's identity. Without these records, millions of Americans would never be able to trace where they came from. Never be able to confirm their ancestry. Never be able to reconnect with their past. And yet, even with all of that at stake, nothing happened. No emergency preservation effort. No national priority. No urgency. Just hesitation. Excuses began to surface. Some officials claimed that water-damaged documents couldn't be restored, that once soaked, they were effectively useless. But that explanation doesn't hold up, because not all of the records were water-damaged. Remember, 38% were completely intact, dry, readable, preservable. So what about those? Why weren't they copied? Why weren't they secured? Why weren't they moved into proper storage? There was no clear answer. Instead, the records were transferred, moved from one place to another, temporary storage, then back again, handled, relocated, shifted around, but never truly protected. And during that time, something even more dangerous than fire began to take effect. Neglect. Paper doesn't need flames to disappear. Leave it in the wrong conditions long enough. It will decay on its own. Moisture seeps in. Mold spreads. Ink fades. Fibers break down. Slowly, silently, what survived the fire started to die anyway, not in a single moment, but over years. And the most unsettling part? No one seemed to be watching. No major updates. No clear preservation efforts. No public urgency. Just silence. As if the surviving pieces of the most important census in American history were simply left to rot. Think about that. A fire destroys part of the record, but leaves enough to save millions of identities. And instead of acting immediately, instead of treating it like a national emergency, the system does nothing. And when nothing happens, time finishes the job, which leads to a realization that's harder to ignore with every step of this story. The 1,890 census wasn't just destroyed by fire. It was abandoned, left exposed, left unprotected, left to disappear. And what came next would make that disappearance official, not through accident, but through decision. After the fire in 1921, there should have been action. Urgent meetings, emergency funding, teams assigned to rescue what remained. Because the situation was clear, millions of records were still salvageable. Time mattered. Every day of delay meant more damage, more decay, more loss. But that's not what happened. Instead, the story goes quiet. The records were moved, packed up, placed into temporary storage, and then almost nothing. No major updates, no large-scale recovery efforts, no clear documentation of preservation work, just a strange, empty gap, nearly a decade of it. From 1921 to 1932, the historical record becomes almost silent. Think about how unusual that is. We know when the fire happened. We know how much survived. We know it could have been saved. But we don't know who was responsible for protecting it. We don't know what steps were taken. We don't know if anyone even tried. It's as if the records were placed in storage, and then forgotten, left in rooms where no one checked on them, left in conditions that slowly destroyed them. Because paper doesn't need flames to vanish. Humidity alone can do it. Moisture seeps in, pages warp, ink bleeds, mold spreads across surfaces. Over time, documents don't just degrade, they dissolve. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. The 38% that survived the fire didn't survive the years that followed. Not because they couldn't be saved, but because no one made sure they were. Imagine that. A national record. The most detailed census ever created. A snapshot of an entire country at a turning point. Sitting in storage. Unprotected. Unprioritized. Unseen. Year after year. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. This wasn't happening in a time of chaos. The United States government was functioning. Agencies were active. Records were being created and preserved every day. Other census data from earlier years was stored safely, protected, maintained. Even newer records, like the 1,920 census, were kept in better conditions. So why was 1,890 different? Why was the most important data set, the most detailed, the most valuable, the one that got ignored? No official explanation, no clear reasoning, just silence. And silence, over time, becomes something else. It becomes permission, permission for neglect, permission for decay, permission for loss. By the time anyone paid attention again, it was too late. What the fire didn't destroy, what time hadn't fully erased, was about to be removed in a way no one could undo. Not by accident, not by disaster, but by paperwork, a list, a routine decision, something so ordinary. No one realized what it would erase until it was already gone. By the early 1930s, what remained of the 1,890 census was fragile, damaged, aging, but not gone. There were still records, still names, still fragments of millions of lives waiting to be preserved. And this is the moment where everything could have changed. Because by now, the United States was beginning to understand something critical. History needed protection. Plans were already in motion. A new institution was being built, one designed specifically to preserve documents like these. The National Archives, a place where records wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't be neglected, wouldn't be lost. But here's where the timeline turns almost unbearable. In December 1932, a routine document was sent. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just a standard administrative list. Papers no longer needed for current business. Scheduled for destruction. Among dozens of entries, There was one line. Simple, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Population schedules 1,890 original. That was it. No explanation. No warning. No emphasis. Just a line on a list. The list was sent to the Librarian of Congress. His job was straightforward. Review the items. Identify anything of historical importance. Save what mattered. And what happened next is one of the most shocking decisions in this entire story. He marked nothing. Not a single item. Not one record from the 1,890 census was identified as worth saving. Think about that. The most detailed snapshot of an entire nation. Millions of names. Millions of identities. A complete record of a turning point in history. And no one stopped it. The list moved forward, unchallenged. On the 21st of February 1933, Congress approved the destruction. And here's the detail that makes it almost impossible to ignore. Just one day earlier, the 20th of February 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the very institution designed to prevent losses like this. One day too late. By 1934, what remained of the 1,890 census was gone. Not burned. Not lost in chaos. Destroyed. Deliberately. There's even a handwritten note that confirms it. Remaining schedules destroyed by Department of Commerce. And beneath it, another note, almost like a whisper of resistance. Not approved by the geographer. Someone objected. Someone understood what was being lost. But it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. Out of nearly 63 million people recorded in 1,890, only about 6,000 names survive today. Less than a fraction of a percent. Everything else, 99% of it, is gone. And not because it couldn't be saved, but because, at some point, someone decided it wasn't worth saving. Which leaves us with a question that cuts deeper than anything before it. How do you look at 63 million lives and decide they don't matter enough to remember? By now, you might want a clean ending. A clear answer. Something simple to hold on to. A single mistake. A single fire. A single failure. But that's not what this is. Because when you step back, this story doesn't look like an accident anymore. It looks like a pattern. Start from the beginning. A record of 63 million people is created. The most detailed census in American history. A complete snapshot of identity, migration, wealth, language, war, and family. Then, it's stored improperly. Not in a fireproof vault, but in a basement, next to fuel, next to heat. A fire breaks out. Part of it is destroyed. But not all. Enough survives to be saved. Enough survives to preserve millions of lives. And then, nothing happens. No urgency. No national effort. No protection. Years pass. The records decay. And finally, they're officially destroyed. Not because they had to be. Not because there was no other option, but because someone signed off on it. Now ask yourself, is that just bad luck, or something else? Because this isn't the only time something like this has happened. In 1973, another fire, another archive. This time at the National Personnel Records Center in Street Lewis. It burned for 22 hours. When it was over, between 16 and 18 million military records were gone. Service histories, medical files, proof of identity for soldiers who had served between 1,912 and 1,964. And the cause? Officially, possibly a discarded cigarette. The same explanation. The same uncertainty. The same outcome. Irreplaceable records turned to ash. Again. Now put the pieces together. A critical record is created. It's stored in a vulnerable place. A fire occurs. The cause is unclear. A large portion is lost, the rest is neglected, and eventually it disappears completely. Once might be coincidence. Twice starts to feel different. And when the pattern becomes visible, it changes the question. Because maybe this isn't about proving a conspiracy. Maybe it's about recognizing something simpler. That systems fail in very specific ways. Repeatedly, predictably. And when they do, they don't just lose paper. They erase people. Think about what the 1,890 census represented. It captured the peak of immigration. Millions arriving between 1,870 and 1,900. It recorded the final generation of Civil War veterans. Men whose stories defined the nation. It documented families, children, homes, debt, language, identity. Everything needed to trace where people came from, to understand who they were. And now, that entire window is gone. A 20-year gap between 1880 and 1900. The exact period when America changed the most. The exact period no one can fully see anymore. And the consequences are still here. Millions of Americans today cannot trace their lineage past that point, not because their history doesn't exist, but because it was never preserved. Or worse, because it was allowed to disappear. So here's the final question. Not about fire, not about archives, not even about 1890. Something deeper, something harder to ignore. If you wanted to disconnect people from their past, from their identity, from their origins, you wouldn't need to erase everything. You just need to erase the right piece and make it look like an accident. And if that's true, then maybe the most unsettling part of this story isn't what we lost. It's how easy it was to lose it, and how quietly everyone accepted it.